too. I haven't cared. I don't know. Last time I wore one. And I'm not going to do a long introduction of you. Everybody knows who you are. I think. All right, good morning. We're going to go ahead and get started this morning. First of all, I'd like to thank our sponsors for breakfast, Verizon. Throughout the course of this conference, you've seen a number of different sponsors for our meals. Please take the time to patronize all those who support the VSA and VSI. It's very important that we continue to support those who support us. This seminar takes a lot of work to put on, this conference, every year, and it's done by just a small group of people, and that's John and his group. John and Elizabeth up here with me, Megan, Susan, Lisa, Katie, and Lucy. It's a lot of work to put these on, and I think we owe them all a nice round of applause for all the work they do. Thank you. So it is my honor and privilege to introduce our first speaker today, the Attorney General. I could sit up here and read his bio and talk about James Madison and William and Mary, but his story, as we heard yesterday with the Lieutenant Governor, is really a story of overcoming odds and succeeding in this country. Much like the Lieutenant Governor, who parents immigrated here from Jamaica, the Attorney General parents immigrated here from Cuba and started on that road to a new life and success. And through hard work and a lot of sweat and tears, was able to make it in this country. So very similar story. So I know he always likes to talk about that road. I'm not going to go into it any more than that. He is the Attorney General of Virginia. Please welcome Jason Maris.
It is wonderful to be here today. I hope everybody will indulge me. Do you mind if I have some of my coffee while I'm speaking? Because I don't complete sentences without caffeine. Is that all right? It is fantastic to be here with you all today and to be among friends. It's particularly great, as somebody noted out in the hallway, to be home. I'm a coastal Virginia boy. I've lived in Virginia Beach most of my life. And so anytime I get to be able to be back home in this area, it is a great joy. So it's wonderful to be with you all today. There's a couple things I wanted to just touch on, both on behalf of the governor and the great staff in the Attorney General's office. But I tell my daughters all the time, gratitude is one of the most underrated of all human traits. Ingratitude is one of the ugliest, but gratitude is one of the most underrated. And I know on behalf of Governor Youngkin, we have such gratitude for the men and women that do so much to both keep us safe and make sure our criminal justice system is the best in the country. One of the more difficult parts of this job, people have said, what has it been like since you've been elected Attorney General? And I said there's been great joy. Virginians are incredible people. And being able to find an excuse to get around every corner of the state, meet with so many. But one of the more difficult things, though, tragically, as we've seen just in the last couple of months, is the number of memorial services and funerals that we've had to attend for those that have fallen. And back in November, there was an officer that was taken from us, Michael Chandler, in Southwest Virginia. And I remember meeting with the family, and his cousin, who's also in law enforcement, noted to me, we were just talking about Mike, and he mentioned this word in passing, and it always stuck with me. He talked about the burden of the badge. The burden of the badge. When I go to work in the morning, I put on a coat and tie, I grab a coffee mug, but for most of the people in this room, when you go to work in the morning, you have to put on a bulletproof vest. It's a job in law enforcement. It's unlike any other job that we do in our society. And it's also a job that's really at times incredibly difficult to set aside when your shift ends and you go home. That burden sometimes carries with you. And so I'm grateful the fact that we still in this country have extraordinary men and women that have a calling, and it is a calling, because so many of you all I know, unfortunately, could make more money in the private sector, but a calling to wear that badge, what it represents, and the burdens that come with wearing that badge. And so when I was campaigning with the governor and lieutenant governor, and we met with a lot of folks in law enforcement, there was a kind of a regular theme we would hear when we talked for people, which was they just felt discouraged. They felt an incredible lack of appreciation, a lack of gratitude for what they do. And so part of our roles as elected leaders is to express, I think, gratitude. And the second is to push those policies that confirm what we feel and what we think. So we're proud of the fact, now I know we don't have a state budget. We'll get there. I'm not in the legislature anymore, so I'm not having to be engaged in budget discussions. I have a lot of friends that still are. I have a high degree of confidence we're going to get one in the next 30 days. But regardless, what I'm even a higher degree of confidence that everybody in this room is going to get a pay increase, which I think is critical for you to do your job. And part of it, your ability to recruit and retain deputies, because the other thing that we're seeing right now in almost every single branch of law enforcement is recruitment. One of the best ways to recruit and retain deputies and officers is to make sure they're compensated. And so we're not only having a pay increase in this budget, we're going to continue to push for that, because I think that's going to be critically important moving forward. The other is to make sure that everyone here is protected from frivolous lawsuits. The fact that qualified immunity was actually on the table to get rid of that, I call that de facto defunding police. Very few people would want to do the job in law enforcement if they knew they could be sued personally. The great irony is that they're not talking about taking away qualified immunity for politicians. They're not talking about taking away qualified immunity for judges. They're not talking about taking away qualified immunity for everybody else that works in government. The only people in government that they've talked about removing qualified immunity so you could lose your home, your life savings, and everything you've ever built up is law enforcement. That's like one of the frustrations people have in government sometimes is they don't think the laws and the rules are being applied equally. And so I know as long as the governor is in office and whatever bully pulpit I have as Attorney General, will be opposed to the weakening of qualified immunity for our law enforcement, because you would have a mass exodus of early retirements, and it would be incredibly next to impossible to recruit. For our sheriffs in our rural areas, we want to make sure you have every tool you have in the toolbox. I know several people have expressed interest in being able to have access to flock cameras. We're going to look at that and make sure that you do, because at the end of the day, we want to make sure you have the same tools that our friends have in our cities as well to make sure that our streets are safe. In my office, Governor Youngkin likes to say the right leaders focus on the right priorities. And so one of the things our office has done is focus back on the law enforcement aspect of the Attorney General's office. It is the largest division in the Attorney General's office, is the criminal division. And I have 21 different sections. It's a fascinating job. So I have everything from the Office of Civil Rights to Consumer Protection to environmental to transportation to child support enforcement to major crimes and emerging threats. And so one of our goals in the Attorney General's office is to make sure that we are those partners with law enforcement to get things done. And so when I've met with Sheriff's Office, when I've gone to the Fusion Center, when I've met with the state police, one of the questions I love to ask them is, what are the tools you need to do to be able to do your job? And what can I do to help you find those tools? Obviously, pay increases, but what are the barriers and the obstacles that prevent you from being able to do your job and do your job with excellence? That's going to be a huge part. We're going to bring in, meeting with some of the prosecutors in the Major Crimes Division. They were no longer prosecuting gang cases. And they wanted to get back to that. They were actually looking at OSHA violations and things of that nature. And so we have stressed that we're going to get back to looking at organized criminal activity to go after some of the worst of the worst. And many of you guys literally are at the front lines. We're working in tandem. I mean, we're proud of the fact that my office announced one of the largest opioid settlements, $500 million that's coming our way from the opioid crisis. And that's going to be one of the largest influx. We have an opioid abatement authority that's going to be sending that money to the localities and how we're going to do treatment. But we're in a unique time as well. And a lot of the sheriff's officers are at the front line. It was great to talk to Sheriff Miller from Bedford, introduced me one of his deputies, that through his work and diligence on MS-13, which is one of the most notorious criminal enterprises in the world, you have 5 individuals that right now are in prison. And so those are the type of stories that rarely make the paper, but you're literally at the front line in a unique moment. We are in the midst of a traumatic, our country's gone through a lot in the last 2 years. But one of the things that we have seen is the ravages of fentanyl, and is changing the way we've dealt with narcotics. It used to be that for you to be able to sell illicit drugs and narcotics, you needed weather, and you needed land, and you needed transportation. What makes synthetics so horrific is you don't have to wait for your poppy seeds to grow. All you need are some chemicals and a lab. 2 years ago, we were losing about 50,000 Americans every 18 months to fentanyl and opioid overdoses. The last 12 months, we lost 105,000 fellow Americans, brothers, sisters, mothers, fathers, sons, daughters. To put things in perspective, that is the equivalent of 2 Vietnam Wars in 12 months. We lost 50,000 men and women in Vietnam, and that was over 15 years. We're losing over 100,000 in 12 months. It is simply staggering. They're coming over the border, and I know almost every single person here in this room has been on the front lines and has seen it. When I'm getting briefings that now we're having to send Narcan out with our sniffing dogs, something's awry. So one thing that we have done, and we're walking through right now, is we're going to be announcing a series of initiatives on fentanyl in Virginia. But it is ravaging communities. Everybody here knows of someone in their community that has lost a loved one and now has an empty chair at every Thanksgiving, every birthday, and every holiday. When it's being laced in marijuana, when it's being laced in recreational drugs, a lot of times people are getting ingested with fentanyl and they don't even know what they're taking. It's unlike anything other. One thing I've realized, and I was a prosecutor at Virginia Beach prior to being here, is there's a couple things that leaves an impression with you when you're working with law enforcement every day and you're working with victims every day. One of the things that leaves an incredible impression is there's no such thing as a victimless crime. I hear that word a lot in our society. What's a victimless crime? There was a case that went through our office of a family, and this is what really crystallized it for me. It was a breaking and entering during the day. Some individuals broke into a home, stole some jewelry, stole some electronics, and they had an 8-year-old daughter, and they went into her room, and they stole some of her jewelry, and they smashed her piggy bank, and that's qualified under the law as a nonviolent offense. But then talking to the family of that victim, that 8-year-old girl had her joy robbed from her because her parents shared with me that now she was waking up for every 2 hours in the middle of the night, insisting that her mommy and daddy lock every door in the house and checking every closet to make sure the bad man wasn't in their home. That 8-year-old girl suddenly had to was dealing with social anxiety for the first time. She's having to go to counseling. She'd wake up in the middle of the night with nightmares. They had to take her out of her school because she no longer felt comfortable. And they had to homeschool her. So when people say there's no such thing as a victimless crime, that has always stayed with me. It doesn't mean we're not smart with our criminal justice. reform, but criminal justice reform without criminal justice isn't reform. I remember talking to a small business owner in Richmond who had his small business that he had and had gotten a second mortgage, his retail shop, to keep afloat, that had gotten destroyed in the summer of 2020 in Richmond. And I asked him, how are things going? Are the customers coming back? And he said, it's easy to wash away graffiti. It is really hard to wash away fear. And so many of you all in this room, you're on the front line of making sure that our communities can wash away that fear. And I think that's going to be critical. G.K. Chesterton noted that if you come up to a fence in the middle of the field, sometimes you should ask why it's there before you knock it down. And so as you talk about things like cashless bail and issues of that nature, we should always ask ourselves, why is that there? Have we learned the hard way? And I like to say the only thing we learn from history is no one learns from history. And there's a lot of things right now that are seen as new and innovative reforms that actually we've tried before in the 1970s with some pretty horrific crime statistics as a result. So I think we should be smart and wise as we look at how we're going to make sure our criminal justice system is better. And the one word we can never forget as we talk about reform is victims. As I noted, there's no victimless crime. I'd like to end with a sense, I don't want to be a total Debbie Downer, with a sense of hope and optimism. We live in an extraordinary country for all of our faults. Sometimes we forget that. Like the lieutenant governor, I'm a child of an immigrant. I'm a child of somebody who fled communist Cuba when she was literally homeless. Didn't have 2 nickels to her name. And Abraham Lincoln called America the last best hope on earth. If you think about that, it's a pretty remarkable statement when he said it. We were 80 years young as a country. We're in the midst of a horrific civil war. I can tell you, nobody in Europe viewed America as the last best hope of anything during those periods of time. But I think Lincoln's genius was he understood what we could be as a country. And if you don't think we're unique, all you have to do is go on YouTube and watch the opening ceremony of the Summer Olympics in Tokyo, the most recent one. Watch the Parade of Nations. 119 countries walk in. 119. From all over the globe. There's only one country that when their delegation walks in, only one out of 119, that their delegation looks like the globe. Every race, every color, every creed. It's amazing to think about. We can recognize where we have fallen far short of being that last best hope, but we can also recognize that we have been that for so many people, for so many places all over the globe. And it's a remarkable thing. I'll end with this. You have a lot of overheated political rhetoric these days. Both parties are guilty of it. But I think it's mindful. I was speaking in an event, and I had a wise Marine tell me, if you go to Arlington National Cemetery and you walk along those Stars of David or those crosses, there's not an R or a D next to anyone's name. So always be mindful that someone who maybe thinks very differently than you politically has given the last full measure of devotion for this extraordinary country. In other words, the person that thinks differently than you politically is not your enemy. So let's stop acting like it. It's an honor to be your Attorney General. It's an honor to be your partner in fighting for victims and keeping our streets safe. Thank you all. God bless you.
presentation? You can stand. Yep. Thank you, Attorney General Ramirez. Appreciate that very much. Our next presentation is going to be from the State Comp Board. Mr. Jeffrey Palmore is a member of the Virginia Government Relations Team at Reed Smith and has been involved with Virginia policy and politics for 2 decades. He served as a top advisor to a governor, attorney general, members of Congress, and candidates for statewide office. He has significant experience drafting legislation, creating and implementing legislative strategies, testifying before committees, lobbying legislators and other government officials, advising on political contributions, and developing creative solutions to help problems with state and local government. And he's been instrumental in the passage of hundreds of pieces of legislation. Robin DeSocio is the Executive Secretary. She's been with the Comp Board since 1990 and Executive Secretary since 2007. She holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Economics from Virginia Commonwealth University and a Master's of Science degree in Criminal Justice also from VCU. And she is a 2000 graduate of the Virginia Executive Institute. And I will say personally that I have reached out to Robin on many occasions, and her responsiveness to my emails or phone calls has been amazing over the years, and I really appreciate it. She may not always have the answer immediately, but she responds immediately and does get the answer to me. So I really appreciate the service from your office and everybody in your office. So, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Jeffrey Palmer, Chairman of the Comp Board, and Robin DeSocio, Executive Secretary.
Good morning, everybody. As Sheriff Leonard said, my name is Jeff Palmore. I'm honored to serve as Chairman of the Compensation Board, and I'm grateful to Governor Youngkin for the opportunity to serve in this role. I'm just here to say a quick hello. I'm new to the role, just got into the role at the beginning of the governor's term in January. What you really want to hear from is Robin. She's the brains of the operation and helps and really manages the show at the Compensation Board. I've taken the last few months to try and roll my sleeves up to get involved in the work of the Comp Board and particularly working on the issues important to the sheriff's offices and Virginia's other constitutional officers. Want to thank the Sheriff's Institute, Sheriff Amos, Sheriff Leonard, and John Jones for the invitation to attend this morning. As I said, Robin's really the brains of the operation. You'll hear from her in just a moment. And she's the one to ask any questions if you have any, because she will most certainly know the answers. I've spent, as Sheriff Leonard mentioned in my bio, I've spent many years working around the General Assembly, and I want to say, I think you know this, but how lucky you are to have John Jones advocating on your behalf. He works so hard every day, and I know he's glad to have Elizabeth by his side now, but working every day to protect your interests. And you're really fortunate to have such a strong advocate on your behalf. But I know he's lucky too, because he's got a good product to sell to the General Assembly, and that's because of the tireless work that you do on behalf of the citizens of your jurisdiction. As many of you know, Governor Youngkin spent time over the last year making his way around the Commonwealth, spending time with you, and we all know that he is committed to supporting our public safety personnel. One of his top funding priorities in the budget, and we hope to see it realized soon, is raising the state's base salary level provided to deputy sheriffs, as the Attorney General said, so that we can prevent significant turnover and we can compete for quality candidates to serve the public. And Robin and I have met with the governor and his team, and he has made clear to us that this is one of his top priorities. So while we're still waiting for a budget, we're seeing very good signs in this regard, that this will be included in the final budget once we see it, hopefully very soon. And Robin will talk about this more in a moment. Another of Governor Youngkin's top priorities is making sure that all of his agencies display exceptional customer service. If it's the DMV or the tax department, their customers are the people of the Commonwealth. But for the Compensation Board, our customers are you all and your offices and the other constitutional officers in Virginia. So we want to make sure that when we're doing our job that we are serving you and the other sheriffs, the other sheriff's deputies, the other constitutional officers in Virginia as well as we can. And so me, Robin, our staff at the Compensation Board is ready to assist you, ready to work with the administration on addressing these priorities and identifying and addressing other significant challenges in the areas of staffing, dealing with the mental illness crisis among the citizens of our Commonwealth. I want to say I really appreciate the relationship between the Sheriff's Institute, the Sheriff's Association, and the Comp Board, and I'm looking forward to working with you all over the coming years, working with Sheriff Leonard, Sheriff Hall, and all the other folks in this room to address the needs of sheriffs in our Commonwealth. Thanks for the opportunity to be here, and I look forward to working with you all over the years. Thank you very much. And with that, I'll turn it over to Robin DeSocio, the Executive Secretary of the Compensation Board. Thanks.
I'm almost too short to see that screen. All right, well, good morning, everyone. I want to thank you all for the opportunity to be here with you this morning. I'm really glad you had the opportunity to hear from and meet our new chairman, Jeff Palmore. He has a lot of valuable experience working in government in a prior administration, as well as his lobbying efforts that he talked about, working with the legislature and getting to know John Jones through those avenues. And he's been really great to work with on issues pertaining to your office and the constitutional officers. Sorry. I do know just from working with him over the last few months that he will be attentive to the needs of constitutional officers, specifically your offices. He'll quickly understand the issues that surround the Compensation Board, funding for your offices, and how best our agency can serve you all and support your needs. So I hope later you'll have a couple minutes to just say hello to him. And hopefully at a future meeting you'll have more time. I know we're getting towards the end of your conference here, so everyone's ready to go. But I think we'll have a good opportunity over the next several years to move forward on things that your offices really need. But I've been asked to speak with you all this morning about, it says, budget concerns and budget update. I'll start with a bit of a budget update. To just kind of discuss where we stand with the budget for next year, given the legislature's return to a special session to come up with a budget for the Commonwealth for the next 2 years. So ordinarily, the Compensation Board would be preparing to approve your final budgets for fiscal year 23 next week. And we would distribute those budgets to you in your localities on Monday, May 2nd. Well, that's our statutory deadline. However, without an approved budget from the legislature, we cannot approve budgets at this time. Our staff is continuing the budget development process. We're continuing to do all the work we need to do internally to get things done as well as we can, pending a budget agreement, so that we'll be able to move quickly once an agreement is decided. So kind of our normal process would be within 2 weeks of adjournment of the regular session, and that was back earlier in March, that we would have provided budget estimates to your offices. At this time, our plan is to provide those estimates within 5 to 7 days of the legislature announcing their agreement on the budget. We would normally have held an annual budget hearing last week, and we will still plan to conduct that hearing at one of our regularly scheduled monthly meetings. If at all possible, we have to provide, or we're required to provide, at least 7 days' notice of that meeting. And again, we can't conduct that until after the legislature has a budget. So we'll work to make sure we can get that step done as soon as possible. Finally, we can only set a budget for the next fiscal year once the legislature approves the budget, but also after the governor has had an opportunity to act on that budget. So depending upon when the legislative budget agreement occurs, there must be at least 7 days for the governor to act on the budget. You know, there's typically adjournment of the regular session, and then they come back 6 weeks later for a reconvene session. So that the reconvene session is scheduled for next Wednesday. So there would, in order for anything to happen sort of on time, there would have to be basically a budget agreement now. The governor would have to have time to review that and act on it. So knowing all of these steps that have to take place and the timing of how they have to occur and in what sequential order, we think it's highly unlikely that there will be an approved budget by May 2nd sent out to your offices. However, as soon as the legislature does agree to a budget, we will provide an update with the timeline based upon whenever that agreement occurs, and that'll provide kind of all of the required steps, what our timing will be to get that done, and we'll get an approved budget to you for fiscal year 23 as soon as we possibly can. In the meantime, we can talk a little bit about what we anticipate will go forward, as well as some budget items that have not yet been decided. I'm not sure where I'm pointing. Okay, so first thing to talk about is there are a handful of funding items that were included in the budget bill when it was introduced last December. And neither the House nor the Senate has proposed changing those items. So while nothing is final until after the legislature agrees to the budget, after the governor approves the budget, there are some items that we expect should go forward in fiscal year 23. There's always still the opportunity for some change, but because no changes have been proposed so far, they're fairly safe that we're at least working on moving forward. So the first item, and you all know this because it's been talked about so much, is the increase in the compensation board funded minimum salary for deputy sheriff positions. And that's moving from the comp board's current minimum salary of $35,149 to $42,000. So under this proposal, any compensation board funded deputy sheriff position, regardless of rank, with a salary below $42,000 will be increased to that level. And yes, this will create some salary compression. There is an additional funding proposal that will provide a further increase to address compression. It provides $100 per year of service in a compensation board funded deputy sheriff position in your office for those with at least 3 years of service, and then providing that increase for up to 30 years of service. So both the increase to the new minimum salary and the compression increase are currently anticipated or proposed to be effective July 1st. For the compression increase, those of you that have been in office for a while will recall that we've completed one of these before, probably about 4 or 5 years ago. And there is some extra work involved to confirm those beginning dates that we use for determining the number of years for compression. There is a little bit of a process involved in that. And so it should be easier this time around. Last time we were starting with data from an old system. This time we have a lot of updates because we've been through this process before, so it should be a little bit simpler, but there still will be a process where we'll send you information about what we're tracking as the number of years. We'll ask for your confirmation. And so this is a process that we'll need to work through as soon as we possibly can once the legislature has agreed to a budget so that we can get those in place and so that you can know what we're looking at in terms of the amounts of those compression increases. So just keep an eye out from us for that process as well as we move forward. I do want to say that both the entry-level salary increase and the compression increase are to the compensation board salary only. And in offices where local supplements are provided, the individual deputies may not necessarily see all of that increase in their local salary because if you have a supplement, the locality can pull some of that additional revenue. So there is no budget language that requires the full amount of the increase to be passed along to the employee in cases where the locality is already supplementing more than that. But there will probably be many cases where the current local salary is less than the $42,000 plus the compression increase, and the local government still has to provide at least that amount. And for some offices, and the thing to keep in mind here is that these increases, even if they're serving to offset some of the local salary supplement, this is a lot of new revenue coming into your locality. And so this is your opportunity to go to your locality and negotiate and really make sure that they're not just sucking up those additional funds, because you're really going to need to work with them to try to use that money that is, kind of freed up by the comp board being able to provide additional funds, to use that money to create some differentiation among your tenured employees. We know that there's going to be compression. We know that the compression increase will not make a huge dent in that. It will help in a lot of cases, but it's probably not going to be enough to create, on the comp board side, huge differentiation in your employees. You really want to negotiate with your locality for those additional revenues that are coming into them to help free up some of those local dollars to create that differentiation that you need to for your tenured and ranked employees. Sorry, I don't think my technical skills, they just get worse as I get older. I don't know how to make this just all come up at once. There are some other items. The next couple of items that I want to talk about, real quickly, just those two items, the new entry-level salary and the compression-based increase, they have not been subject to any proposed changes during the regular session of the General Assembly. So while we do still need legislative approval and the governor's approval, we are not at this time anticipating any major changes to those two proposals. There are some additional funding items that are sort of up in the air as we await for a legislative budget decision. The first one would be across-the-board salary increases for all sheriffs and their employees, whether we're talking about deputy sheriffs or sworn employees, all constitutional officers and all of their employees. So the introduced budget provided for a 5% salary increase on July 1st of 2022 and a 5% salary increase on July 1st of 2023. This increase was intended to be provided to all officers on top of the increase to the $42,000, as well as to all non-sworn civilian or staff positions in your offices. Now, we have identified a funding shortfall for some of this, and we're working. We've provided some increase to the legislature. We're waiting for some, again, for them to come to conclusion on their budget so that we can make sure we have everything we need for this. I do want to mention that the compression increase that we talked about earlier would be added after the increase to 42 and any across-the-board increase. So compression is not going to increase that 5% or whatever ultimately gets approved. Compression would be last. So in addition to, so the 5% was included in was included in the budget bill when it was introduced. But this is a budget item for which there are opposing proposals in the House and Senate. So the Senate budget amendment has kept the proposal at 5% for both years, whereas the House has proposed an amendment for a 4% increase in both years, plus a one-time bonus in each year. The other thing to keep in mind, though, the House amendments also provide that the 4% increase in fiscal year 23 would only be provided to deputy sheriffs that have an increase of would only be provided to deputy sheriffs that have received a salary increase of less than 7.5% when considering the increase to the entry-level salary. Since those deputies with current compensation board salaries between $35,149 and $39,072 will receive a salary increase of 7.5% or greater when increasing to $42,000, those deputies would not receive the 4% across-the-board increase in fiscal year 23 under the House proposal. Now, I just want to mention, this represents about 70% of deputies that currently have comp board salaries of less than $42,000 that will see that increase to $42,000. So this does reduce, obviously, potential funding for salary increases. It does, however, alleviate some of the salary compression that would be created by the increases. So this is one of the things that the legislature is going to have to balance, that they're going to have to figure out how best they want to address the salary issue, where the funding is going to come from, what they're ultimately going to decide upon as it pertains to that across-the-board increase. So again, this is one of those items where we have differing versions across the House and Senate, and until they approve a budget, we won't know which direction that particular increase is going to go. Whichever across-the-board increase is ultimately approved, however, these increases do require that the locality provide at least the amount of the comp board increase as a salary increase to your employees. So the locality cannot just absorb those funds by a local supplement and not provide anything to your employees. Okay. A couple of other items. There is a fourth funding item that impacts jails. So just those of you with jails, or obviously the rest of you participating in regional jails. This item was included in the introduced budget as well, and this was to provide a total of 502 new positions in jails to address behavioral health care and case management. So about half of these positions would be designated as a new type of position in the jail for providing case management. And those would be funded at full salaries, and I say that because the other half are the fulfillment of the existing staffing standard that we have for the partially funded medical and treatment positions that are in jails. Those are positions where we allocate the position, but the salary that we set represents only 2/3 of the salary, and the locality is required to provide at least the additional 1/3. So about half of those 500 positions would be just fulfilling that existing staffing standard, positions that are not currently funded for the medical treatment positions in your jails, and then the other half would be new positions for behavioral health case management. These positions now were, again, included in the introduced budget effective July 1st of 2022, but this item has been affected by amendments, proposed amendments on both the House and Senate that actually phase in the allocation of the positions and the funding over the 2-year biennial budget period. That's probably very reasonable. The idea that jails that are having a hard enough time finding people just to fill the positions that they have, it might be difficult to try to bring in 500 new positions statewide for behavioral health all at one time. So the House proposes funding for all of these positions, but allocating 25% of the positions every 6 months over the course of the next 2 years. So by January of 2024 and fiscal year 24, all of the positions would be allocated. The Senate proposes also phasing them in at that 25% at a time every 6 months, but only through the first 50% of the positions. So they would allocate 25% July 1, another 25% January 1 of 2023, and then they would hold it at that level throughout fiscal year 24. So again, this is a funding item that until the legislature comes to agreement on a budget, we won't know which way it's going to go, but we anticipate that there should be something coming forward for these positions. Lastly, the House and Senate have both included proposals to increase the per diem rate that is paid for inmates housed in your jails. These are the quarterly inmate per diem payments made by the compensation board, either back to the locality or to regional jails. Currently, the compensation board provides inmate per diems based upon the actual inmate counts at a rate of $4 per day for every local responsible inmate. So that's your folks that are pretrial, those that are sentenced misdemeanors, or those that are sentenced felons with a sentence of 12 months or less. The current rate is $4 per day for local responsible, $12 per day for your state responsible inmates, which are those sentenced felons with sentences of 1 year or more. So the House proposal will increase the state responsible per diem rate from $12 per day to $16 per day at a cost of about $9.3 million per year. The Senate proposal will increase the local responsible per diem rate by $1 from $4 to $5 per day, and the state responsible inmate per diem rate by $2 from $12 to $14 per day, and this is at a total cost of about $6.6 million per year. So again, the ultimate decision regarding the rates for per diems also remains subject to final budget approval. I know I've run through a lot of numbers this morning. Hopefully everyone had their coffee. I appreciate your patience as we talked about all of this and the items that are in the budget and what's still a bit in flux. I want to move on to just a couple other reminders and comments. Nothing big. Just want to say, again, just for jails specifically, I do want to remind you all that we are having our biannual LIDS conference this year. That is the conference that is specifically related to the local inmate data system, that we invite your LIDS technicians and your folks that work with the records and getting that information into the system. That's scheduled for May 11th to 12th. It's a virtual conference this year, so it'll be online, but we really encourage your folks to participate and appreciate you supporting their attendance of that. It's a good opportunity for them to meet their biannual training requirements, because there is as you all know, there's a training requirement for those that work with the LID system, as well as just to learn more about reconciliation, the financial processes, things like that. This year's conference is going to have a session to go over the earned sentence credit changes that will impact release dates for some inmates on July 1st and how those changes will be implemented. We have someone from DOC who's going to come and talk about how that will impact your state responsible inmates that are housed in your jail. There is also some recent information that we sent out that the retroactive application of earned sentence credit changes is not going to be applicable to your local responsible felons. So make sure you keep an eye out for that. But again, I appreciate you all giving that opportunity to your folks to attend. The last thing I want to mention again, I think I said something about this last year, but again, we've had some transitioning of our customer service staff over the last couple of years. In September of last year, we brought in 2 new technicians to work with your offices. Joan Bailey, who was our former retiree and came back to work with us temporarily, she's actually still with us and she's still assisting with that transition. She's still with us temporarily, although she's currently helping in another area because we have another employee who's out on parental leave. But our 2 new folks, Brian Bennett and Donnet Foster, who came in September, they've been working really hard. They came in September and they were agreeable enough, I guess, brazen, bold enough that they actually did the training for all of your newly elected officers after only having been with us for a couple of months. So we're really pleased with how they're really learning things, and I hope that they're being helpful to you all. But again, I appreciate your patience as we kind of work through all of that. Bill Fassell, who was with your offices for a couple years, is still there. He's kind of taking the lead on training and providing guidance to all of our new customer service staff, and so he's still available to help everyone, as am I. So again, I'm hopeful that Brian and Donna have the chance to attend one of these meetings with me in the near future so that you all can meet them in person. But we're pleased with the job that they've been doing, and certainly if you're not, let me know. But I hope they'll have the opportunity to meet you all soon. This does wrap up what I was hoping to talk about today. If you all have any questions for me, I'm happy to answer them. I will be around for a bit afterwards, but I know you all are probably antsy to hit the road. So if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer them now. Yes?
As far as the compression pay, the process that we went through last time, is there any talk from the compensation board? Say we have an employee that's been in VRS for 10 years, 5 years as a police officer, 5 years as a deputy. Is the compression pay going to be for 5 years that they've been on the compression board or compensation board, or is it going to cover the whole 10 years? Because last time it really caused problems when we tried to do the compression pay, even at $85. It really was a problem for the locality because we've had people that were in VRS, but the compensation board didn't recognize.
Right. The funding is based on their comp board time, and we can get some information from VRS, but it's difficult sometimes to match that up. But
I just think that sometime the state needs to take a look at, just because a deputy has only been at the sheriff's office for 5 years but has 10 years in law enforcement, I think the state should recognize that 10 years.
And I understand that. I mean, they're looking at it from the perspective of their time as a compensation board funded employee. You can also have people who come into law enforcement later. They maybe come into your office later, and maybe they have 10 years in VRS in a completely different type of position, and then that wouldn't really be, it wouldn't really meet the requirements of what they're trying to do based upon your law enforcement service. So it's just not something that's been considered given all the broad variations that there can be out there and the ability to get all of that information. So typically, it has been based upon their compensation board time.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks
for coming.
Anybody else?
Yes, ma'am.
Hi.
Hey, Robin. The way I understand it, just to piggyback on what Sheriff Smith was saying, I'm David Hill, Sheriff of Nelson. But if you have a ship jumper that has come from another sheriff's office and they were in a comp board position, the way this is written, it only applies to their service with their current agency, correct?
So what we did last time and what we'll try to do again this time is we gathered information about that other time. And so, that's an example. You also have some examples of, newer regional jails where a local jail closed, and, you would have had this experience many years ago, but where the local jail closed and those individuals went straight from the local jail to the regional jail. And so that was really not an interruption of service and not anything under their control, right? So we did last time ask for information about those kinds of transitions, the transition from a comp board funded deputy sheriff position in one office to another office. And then at the end of the day, it really depends on how much funding we have as to whether or not there's sufficient funding to cover some of that. And so I know last time we were able to cover some of that, but it's one of those things that we can't answer right off the bat until we see, we'll ask you for that information, and then we'll see what the big picture looks like in terms of how much funding we have as to whether we can consider that comp board funded deputy sheriff time in another office.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Robin, the big thing about what we look at every year in May with y'all waived it last year. As far as historical low numbers for people being in custody with COVID, with courts being shut down, what is the comp board's position for this May about cutting positions for sheriff's offices?
So last year, and the big place that this is an issue is in court services when we look at the court days and that type of thing. So last year, the compensation board implemented a moratorium on any position reallocation. We're still going through the data to look at it and kind of see how it looks if we're ready to go back and start using data. We're probably never going to incorporate the 2020 data, but a lot of it really depends on what the data looks like. And this is part of the process of what we're doing right now, so I don't have a direct, an exact answer. But for sure, we're trying to discount any data that shows a clear sign of the slowing down in the courts. So there was a moratorium on the reallocation policy this last year. I think just in general, that means we won't have any direct reallocations this year. Whether anybody's subject to it next year, I don't know yet. It depends on what the numbers look like and whether it looks like there's kind of a return to normalcy. And I don't know if you were talking about just on the court side or on the jail side. So
Both, Robin, both.
Okay, so on the jail side, populations are down for sure in jails. We saw kind of a tick up on the state responsible side several months ago. We talked to DOC about that. I think they were having some issues with COVID and slowing down intake, but over the last month or so, I've seen kind of a dramatic intake of state responsible inmates. We've seen some drops in local responsible this year, so we'll definitely be looking at it this year. Last year, we just kind of put a freeze on it. We didn't want to make assumptions about all of these people, not being in the population, that's just how it was going to be. And so we did kind of a moratorium on those reallocations as well. Again, we're looking at that data right now. We're looking at the last 3 years of data to see kind of what kind of trends we're seeing and whether or not they look, still like realistic long-term drops as to whether there will be reallocations. But it is possible that there will be some reallocations on that side this year.
Thank you, Rob.
Mm-hmm.
Just to follow up on the jail numbers, if I could, Robin. Because of COVID in 2020 and the residual issues of COVID in 2021, jail populations a lot of the times have been reduced because of a proactive approach by either Commonwealth attorneys or the courts to get people out of that environment to protect them from any potential COVID infections being in basically, the nursing homes
Yes.
of inmates. So I hope that you guys will take that into consideration when looking at the numbers from last year, and maybe continue to put the moratorium on losing staff as a result of low jail numbers until we get a little bit further away from COVID and the courts start doing what the courts are going to do. Because part of the reason the numbers are down as well is because the courts have not been functioning. Again, we got another Supreme Court moratorium on things, or emergency order, and all of that affects our jail numbers. So.
Good morning, Robin. I usually attack you once you leave the door and ask you a few questions, but this may be something that people are wondering about is funding for the Master Deputy Program and the Sheriff's Accreditation Program. Any idea where that may fall this current year coming up?
So there's we did not have any kind of shortages in funding for the Sheriff's Accreditation Program. So there was no additional funding that was sought for that. Generally speaking, what we've seen is that turnover of individuals who are currently accredited is usually enough to cover those coming in. So there was not any additional funding for those career development programs per se. There is money in the Master Deputy Program, so I'm not anticipating any changes in that. We're still going to kind of have to work through how all that's going to work with the changes in the salaries in the Master Deputy Program, so that's something that we're still looking at. But we don't have any funding losses there. We don't have any shortages there at this point in time, so I'm not anticipating any major changes with that. Sheriff Milholland, are you coming up?
Good morning.
Morning.
Do you know when the positions might be filled? I'm due like 7 or 8 for patrol and probably 7 for civil.
Are you talking about law enforcement and court services?
Yes, ma'am.
So the law enforcement positions have not been funded. Additional law enforcement positions have not been funded since 2007, 2008. That's pretty high on our list of things that we submit for consideration every year. And so, again, unless we have reallocations because of drops in someone else's workload, we don't really have any positions to allocate for the law enforcement or for the court services. There were some additional positions that were allocated last year for court services, but there are not any new positions that have been proposed for the next year. So right now, we don't have anything. The law enforcement has really grown a lot over the last several years. We're up to over 250 positions that are due statewide, and so that's something we've really been working on. There's so much focus on the salaries. It's hard when there are so many unaddressed issues from so many years that the focus has been more on salaries, but we are still working on that law enforcement issue.
Thank you very much.
Is that it? All right. Well, thank you all. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and for you all to meet our chairman, Mr. Palmore, and look forward to working with you all. Thank you.
Thank you. Absolutely. I wish I had a jail in the county population. Mine's a hub. Oh. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. So our next presentation is our last one for the day. Appreciate everybody's patience with this. You know, last night, John recognized Megan for her 25 years with the Virginia Sheriff's Association and Institute. John is just in his 46th year, so he's getting close. But we appreciate your service. If you haven't paid attention to the General Assembly this year, either in person or streaming it, if you have paid attention to it, you would have seen Elizabeth there almost every day. I've seen her testify before so many committees this spring. It was just really neat to see her go up there. She represented us with the highest degree of professionalism. I thought she did a fantastic job for us and really represented us well. So thank you I know that was your first venture with us. Thank you so much for what you did for us on that end. So now we're going to turn it over to John and Elizabeth to talk about some of the new laws coming into this General Assembly.
Thank you, Sheriff Leonard. So we passed out a 2022 session priorities and outcome, and we'll talk about that briefly. We're going to walk through some of this notebook that we have there, and I want to talk to you about the process on why we do what we do, and then we'll get into some of the bills that were actually passed or were not passed by the General Assembly and what the outcomes were. So if you look at the little scorecard there, we've put some highlights in. I'm not going to go over the salaries again. Robin just talked about those, and including the salaries across the board, pay raises and compression pay. It's been the Sheriff's Association's priority for a long time. We were successful on FOIA, which is number 2. We were successful to roll back some of the Marcus Alert mandates for smaller localities. We were successful in getting principals, again, to report crimes to sheriffs and law enforcement agencies. We were successful on the facial recognition technology. The bill is now before the governor. We worked hard. It was actually taken away 2 years ago, last year, by the General Assembly. It was only taken away from local law enforcement, not state law enforcement. So the state agencies, the state police, could still use facial recognition technology, and we couldn't. We put a bill in to fix that. It was a controversial bill that passed by narrow margins. The governor is supporting it. He submitted 2 technical amendments, and they'll be back up next Wednesday for the General Assembly to approve or not approve. And either way, we'll be in good shape with using facial recognition technology. On TDOs and ECOs, we ended up with a bill by Senator Favola that talks about transportation and custody. It's an important bill. It's a medium-sized Band-Aid. It doesn't fix the problem. It still leaves the patients without service, but it is supposed to help our custody issue when we're sitting there. So we hope that gets funded. The governor did sign the bill, and we'll be talking about that more later. Then there was a bill on cameras, covering cameras in jails, and there were a lot of bad bills on jails that were killed and rolled into studies. So having said that, let me just tell you a little bit about them on page 1 of the presentation. We have a legislative committee that consists of the board of directors of the Virginia Sheriff's Association, plus 9 members appointed by the president, and the chairman is appointed by the president. This year's chairman is Sheriff Arthur Townsend, and you can see there the members of the legislative committee. That is a working committee. The next page shows what we did. What Elizabeth and I do is every day get up and look at all the bills that were introduced, and we decide which ones we want to deal with, which ones relate to sheriffs and jails and law enforcement. And then we send those bills to the legislative committee, and all of this is done in one day pretty much. The legislative committee will get the bill, they'll look at it, they'll vote on it, and they'll send a reply back to the web-based system that we have, and then we will decide what to do with it. Some bills, if it's an overwhelming vote to support the bill, then we'll support it. Some bills, if there's an overwhelming vote to oppose the bill from the committee, we'll oppose it. If it's a split vote, we may not really do anything, and we'll decide what to do on these bills based on other factors in addition to the vote. You can't oppose everything. You lose your credibility. So we kind of pick our fights, and we go from there. But having said that, the legislative committee reviewed and voted on 152 bills this year. The next couple of pages deal with the budget, and Robin has covered the budget adequately, and I know she got a lot of questions. Let me just say this about that, and the questions that she got about why she's funding certain things. The compensation board, they don't make the pie. They only cut the pie. And you're going to get your slice of it, and when the slices are done, there's no pie left. And at the end of the day and at the end of the year, they're not sending money back unspent to the General Assembly. And that's where we are now. They're getting ready to cut the pie. They don't know what the pie is going to be, but be assured they're going to cut the pie, and there's not going to be any pie left over. In fact, at the beginning of the process, they went to the governor, the previous administration, and asked for $1,000 to $1,500 to be funded. There were a lot of budget requests. You probably don't know this. They were our advocates early on, and they were competing with the other billions of dollars of requests. And we ended up doing fairly well, I think. We did better than we usually do. We got jail per diems funded and increased. Hadn't happened in a long time. We actually asked them to be restored. We got salary increases. We got compression pay. We got across-the-board raises. And again, they just cutting the pie. And they want more pie just like we all do, but when it runs out, it's out. When you cut your slices up and it's gone, that's it. And next year when the comptroller looks at the comp board budget, they're not turning money back in, it's unspent. Maybe a little teeny bit that they couldn't sweep out the corner, but most of the time, it's all gone. If I'm saying anything incorrectly, please correct me. Yeah. All right, so let's flip over on page 4. Talking about the multiplier. We put in a bill, I don't know if you have that or not, page talking about the multiplier for a little bit more. I don't know where my flipper is. All right, Senate Bill 507. This was an important bill for us. It actually passed the Senate to mandate localities to go to the 185 multiplier. We found out most sheriff's offices don't have it. We also found out that the House had no appetite to mandate anything to localities to fund for retirement. So when I went to see the chairman of the Appropriations Committee, he right up, he said, John, I love you, we're going to do all we can do, but we're not going to mandate localities to do this. And that's why it didn't pass. They're not going to do an unfunded mandate. So what's the next best thing you can do is follow the advice of the VRS people that were here earlier, they were yesterday, to get your actuarial study done to see what it would cost to increase your multiplier. And I know of a couple of localities that are doing that, and I was surprised how inexpensive it was. You know, just take a look at it. Go back to that VRS presentation, get the resolution, contact VRS, and see if your locality won't consider doing that multiplier. Okay, I'm gonna go to the next slide. Elizabeth and I are gonna switch off on some of these. She was totally helpful during the General Assembly, helping me review these bills, showing up, giving a much better presentation before these Senate committees than I ever could. And so you're going to be seeing a lot more of Elizabeth's presentations, and starting right now on mental health.
So as John mentioned, we met with the Legislative Committee in November, and the Legislative Committee decided on a number of priorities. Number one is always the budget considerations, the salary increases. Number two is mental health transportation. We've heard a lot about it this week. We wrote a bill. We asked Margaret Ranson if she would put it in the House, and she did, House Bill 163. The bill did a number of things. It included a provision to require that the magistrate not issue a TDO unless a bed actually existed and was available. It firmed up some of the provisions requiring the state facilities to immediately accept a number of other provisions to reduce the burden on law enforcement, to reduce that custody period, to get help for the folks in crisis more promptly. That bill did not make it very far. It was rejected in the House. Appropriations. It should not have cost money, so I'm not really sure what their theory was on that, but they rejected it and it died. There were a number of other bills that we looked at to support. House Bill 135 with Mike Cherry also was an alternative custody bill to allow for the alternative transportation providers to do the sitting with in the hospital, however long it would take. That also died in appropriations. House Bill 159 was also an alternative custody that got rolled into House Bill 163, so they died together in House appropriations. House Bill 1037 was identical language to those other bills. House Bill 1147 and Senate Bill 682 were identical bills in each house. I think the goal of those bills was good. It was intended to be more burden on the state facility to provide custody and less burden on law enforcement. The language of the bills, however, put the default on law enforcement, and so we fought the language and tried to get the spirit of the bill redesigned. We were successful in that. It ultimately got rolled in with additional rephrasing language that we provided into Senate Bill 268. Senate Bill 1676 was also an alternative custody by a contract provider similar to what we saw in the other House bills. Alternative transportation folks can be used for alternative custody. Senate Bill 373 was a bill that we fought, extending the ECO period to 48 hours. I think 8 is enough, but they wanted to extend that. Senate Bill 650 was requiring the ER to take custody of an ECO patient, and that was killed at the behest of the emergency rooms, as you can imagine. Senate Bill 713 also was extending the ECO time period if the person is with a crisis stabilization unit, which would relieve law enforcement responsibility to a degree there. That one got carried over to next year. So what passed? Not a lot. Senate Bill 202 is a work group for alternative custody. It's a pretty narrow focus. It's not a work group to solve the problems of mental health transportation. It's really for alternative custody. So we will, the Sheriff's Association is part of that work group. We will see what we can do to get the very most out of it that we possibly can for law enforcement. Senate Bill 593 is really a police-specific, not sheriff bill. It allows auxiliary police to be used for the custody because the sheriffs have the privilege of not being micromanaged by that section of the code. It doesn't apply. Senate Bill 268 is the only substantive bill that passed, and we worked to help it get through, even though it is a very petite Band-Aid. It provides alternative custody may be used when alternative transportation is designated by the magistrate. So that's pretty narrow. If alternative transportation is not used in your jurisdiction in a significant amount, then this will be equally insignificant. If alternative transportation is used in your jurisdiction, the AT provider can begin sitting with the individual as soon as the TDO is executed. So this only applies to TDOs, not ECOs. You're on the hook for the 8 hours, but as soon as the TDO is executed, then the allied or whomever you have in your jurisdiction can come and begin sitting however long it takes, then put them in the car, take them where they need to go. There is a small provision that we added, the VSA added to that bill that requires the magistrate. Currently, the law says the magistrate may use alternative transportation if it's suggested. The tiny provision that we added requires the magistrate to use it every time it's suggested and appropriate, in the hopes that we might increase those numbers that alternative transportation and now custody is used in your jurisdictions. In addition to budget and mental health transportation, our legislative committee looked at a number of bills from the last 2 years that were particularly detrimental to the ability of law enforcement to do its main function of enforcing laws, and we've labeled that repeal or reform bills. So we attempted to roll back some of the moves that were made in the 2020 and 2021 legislatures. We met with Rob Bell, who is a delegate, chairman of the House Courts Committee, and he wanted to know what the sheriffs wanted as far as repeal and reform of those. And he facilitated us putting in bills on quite a number of these points. The first is returning those offenses that were made secondary offenses back to primary. There were 3 bills that were pretty comprehensive undoing all of them in one fell swoop. House Bill 79, 122, and 960. All of those failed. They got smushed together. That's the technical term, smushed together, in the House, but when they got to the Senate, they did not survive. What did pass? Loud exhaust. You may now stop vehicles for loud exhaust as a primary offense. You're welcome. One of the other repeal reforms that we were working on was the sealing of criminal records. And this may be not top of mind for you yet. It's a bill that was passed in the last 2 years. The word sealing is really, in my opinion, a pleasant word for hiding criminal convictions. So we had a speaker in the fall conference who spoke about this bit of legislation to hide criminal records. Generally speaking, what it does is hides deferred and dismissed marijuana and underage alcohol, and I think there's probably pretty broad support for that. But in addition to that, there's automatic hiding of criminal convictions for assorted misdemeanors like petty larceny, trespassing, unlawful entry. But there's also petition to hide your criminal convictions for Class 5 and 6 felonies. Well, that includes things like gang violence, attempted murder, indecent liberties with children, attempted aggravated sexual battery, and a variety of other things that we might want to know people have convictions for. So that's on the books. It goes into effect in 2025 as soon as the Virginia State Police comes up with a database to manage this. So it was on our agenda to work to repeal, if possible, that particular section of the code that allows criminals to hide their convictions for serious crimes. HB 181 was a bill to repeal it in its entirety. That did not even make it out of the House courts. Our bill was HB 322, and what we really focused on in an attempt to kind of slice off the most egregious part of the sealing statutory scheme was to limit the convictions that can be sealed. So instead of allowing people to seal their sex crimes and crimes of violence, we created a bill that said only if it was deferred or dismissed. So convictions could not be sealed. One of the more interesting parts of this statutory scheme is the criminalization of the dissemination of information. So if you have access to the information, not the database, but if you know of the information that is then sealed and you disseminate it, that's a crime. So the way it's written, if you were the court deputy in the courtroom when somebody got convicted of indecent liberties and they got it sealed later, and then you talk about the day that you were in court and the person got convicted, that is theoretically a Class 1 misdemeanor. It's particularly broad, and so we, in our bill, eliminated that to just be limiting to malicious dissemination and having that be a misdemeanor rather than felony, which it currently is. This is a pretty high priority. It affects law enforcement. It doesn't feel like it yet because it's not on the books until 2025, but it's not in effect until 2025, but it has a potential to be of huge impact. It did not go anywhere. It did not make it out of House courts. We have 2 more years to take a stab at it. Interestingly, there were 3 bills, HB 279, which expanded this bill, which is already fairly broad, expanded the number of crimes and types of crimes that could be sealed. SB 443 likewise expanded the classes of felonies and the types of records that could be sealed. SB 564 expanded the types and decreased the time period that you have to be free of criminal charges to get your conviction sealed. And right now there is a limit on how many crimes you can get sealed in a lifetime. That bill eliminated that limit. Those bills failed. We fought against those as well, the expansion. Also, a priority item on our legislative agenda was undoing the requirement for the acquisition of military equipment. The particular provision, which seems to have been an accident on the part of the legislature, would preclude the use of shotguns and shotgun ammunition. And so HB 813 repealed the entire section of code, and that did not make it very far. SB 328 changed the limitation to just really focus the .50 caliber requirement for both ammunition and the firearm on rifles, and so does not cover shotguns. And that HB 813 was combined into it, so they have the same language, and that did pass. So that had been fixed, if you will, in the budget language from last year, but budget language is only good for the year of the budget, and so this is a permanent fix. Also on our legislative agenda was the capital area gun ban. Currently, the law precludes law enforcement officers from carrying weapons on the Capitol grounds unless you're actually working. These two bills, one repealed and one simply exempted the law enforcement from that requirement, and they also failed. Search warrant, another legislative committee priority. There was HB 109, which repealed the entirety of the daytime requirement. Currently, it's 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. with a number of hoops to jump through if you're outside that time period. Rob Bell put in a bill that would address a number of those things, expanding the time period, reducing the hoops, again, that you would have to jump through, allowing a no-knock search warrant in certain circumstances, allowing for a search warrant to be issued if it's necessary to get the evidence, was some of the phrasing, outside that 8 to 5 range. When he actually put it in, he felt that it would be more successful if we really focused in on the time frame, so he put in a bill changing the permissible hours to 6 a.m. to 9 p.m., which gets at most of your search warrants. That made it out of the House. The Senate amended it to 7 a.m. to 6 p.m. That's not a lot. That's just 1 hour on each end. That's in conference. It's unknown whether that will make it out next week or not. If it does, it's likely to be that very tiny 1 more hour in the morning, 1 more hour in the afternoon. FOIA. So again, one of the reforms that we were looking for is to undo the requirement that you disclose criminal investigative files. Was a pretty broad-ranging FOIA change. HB 890 was what we had put in with Terry Kilgore to repeal that provision, to undo it, put it back the way it was. As it went through, it seemed to be less likely to be successful in that broad sweeping repeal. So HB 734 was kind of the preeminent reform of that reform. And that was successful. It has made it through. It's been passed the General Assembly and signed into law. And it has returned the disclosure of criminal investigative files to discretionary. There are some exceptions to that. If the case is not ongoing, a victim or family, if they're not suspects or person of interest, may FOIA the file. And there are certain exceptions for attorneys in post-conviction proceedings. There are quite a number of restrictions, so now this section of the code for FOIA has become even more voluminous, so your FOIA officer will need to read up on that. But there are quite a number of restrictions on that. It's not just a blanket, anybody can get a criminal investigative file for any reason they want. There was a bill for service of process. This was not on our legislative agenda. At this point, I'm just talking about bills that are maybe of interest, that we either took a stand on or we're just advising you. This is not comprehensive, but it's the highlights, if you will. Service of process. Bill from the House and Senate joined together. It's been signed into law. provides that investigators employed by the Indigent Defense Commission, so public defenders, may serve witness subpoenas without permission from the sheriff. That's a change. It used to be that they could serve process of any kind with a permission from the sheriff. And the Commonwealth Attorney's Office has no change. That's still, they can serve process with the permission of the sheriff.
That was a sticker. We took the Commonwealth attorneys out where they have to have permission from the sheriff. That was the point of the bill.
John's going to talk to you about the jail.
Okay. On jails, the next slide talks about a number of failed bills. Most of these bills we opposed, and successfully, they failed. Some of them later on, you'll see, were rolled into a study. We've had minimum standards for identification and care of inmates with development disabilities, minimum standards for confidentiality of attorney-client visits, no inmate telephone record bill relating to that, prohibits the use of canines to extract people. We're not going into these cells with dogs every day, and we got it limited actually to DOC, and they finally killed that in the House Public Safety Committee, chaired by Delegate Wilt. Requiring additional information to be reported on the DEFA facility. There'll be a study relating to some of this. And there's another bill on canines, and in Bill 989 to increase the amount of DOC to compensate local jails, to increase the per diems. That bill failed, but Robin talked about it a while ago. There is an increase for per diems in both budgets. It's not identical yet, so we'll see what happens with that. What did pass was, I'm going to talk about 1332 and 700, simply made it a crime to cover cameras in jails. And Senate Bill 673 simply allows legislators to come into the jails, and I don't see where that was a problem to begin with. Our committee voted to endorse it. Elizabeth's going to talk about 502.
502 was a bit of a common sense bill. It's pretty typical that the judge will say you get credit for time served on, it's constitutionally required to get credit for time served on your actual convicted charges. Very often a judge would say you get credit for time served on charges that were dismissed that are related, but they were not required to do so. This bill says the judge must give credit for time served on related charges from the same criminal incident that have been dismissed. So if you had an early charge and then the charges were replaced, maybe you had a second-degree murder charge, and at some point they're indicted for first-degree murder, but they spent 6 months in jail on the second-degree murder, they're going to get credit for that 6 months, even though that's not ultimately what they were convicted of. This is, in practice, what has been happening in large part. It is now the law.
Moving on to jail, let's see, work groups. Let's flip that to the next slide. These were bills that were passed, and they started off as really bad bills, and many of you were engaged in these bills as we progressed through the session. They were trying to eliminate all jail fees, inmate fees. So we ended up with an inmate study work group, especially I'm talking about, let's see, Senate Bill 441 and 665 and 581. The Board of Regional and Local Jails will do a study, and it has all these advocacy groups that'll be doing the study, and then someone from the Sheriff's Association. But the language says at least one. So I've been talking to the Secretary's office, Secretary of Public Safety. We want equal representation. When we're having these advocates telling us we don't want any inmate fees, I'm asking for an equal number of sheriffs or at least regional jail folks on our side to preserve the jail fees. We have a study also on inmate work release programs, and we agreed to participate in that study, and that will take place. So we'll be seeing a lot of studies. If you see something here that you really want to participate in, let us know. Maybe we can get you as a member of one of the study groups.
So just hitting the highlights of bills that were brought in for law enforcement administration. SB 181, there was a bill to require that everyone be vaccinated if their locality or department required it in order to get workers' compensation related to COVID. That failed. HB 493 was a bill requiring the FOIA release of law enforcement personnel records, would be the only personnel records that have to be released. That failed. HB 609 was this year's stab at eliminating immunity. This one was pretty broad-ranging, affecting every government employee except for legislators and judges. That died quickly. HB 611, that was a bill by the same Delegate Jeff Bourne, for the early identification system database for law enforcement officers. That database is supposed to, let me find the language here, to identify and assess patterns of behavior, including misconduct and high-risk behavior, or performance of law enforcement officers and law enforcement agency employees. One of the delegates who was speaking in opposition referenced the, I think, 90s movie of Minority Report, where you're supposed to predict the bad conduct down the road based on factors right now of law enforcement. That also died. HB 870.
Tell them the chief supported that bill.
John wants me to mention that the chiefs of police spoke in support of that bill, HB 611. HB 870 is a bill that was micromanaging the law enforcement officer internal investigation, specifically requiring that if there was a use of force investigation, that the law enforcement officer must be interviewed within 24 hours of the incident. That died. HB 1142 was a pretty significant expansion of the Community Policing Act, requiring quite a bit more data to be collected and for it to be fairly comprehensive to cover nearly every interaction that a law enforcement officer has with a citizen, that they would be required to collect all this data. That also died. SB 669 was another micromanagement of law enforcement procedure requiring certain hoops to jump through for citizen complaints. And then that died. HJ, House Joint Resolution 60 from Delegate Wampler, was an attempt to add to the Constitution a guarantee for qualified immunity for law enforcement officers. That died. But what passed? So what would be relevant going forward for law enforcement administration? DCJS training on human trafficking, that's a new requirement. PERC retention, so generally speaking, if you have a physical evidence recovery kit that is not being tested under the law, you have to retain it, hold on to it for 10 years. The delays in the Marcus alert system, so we've heard a couple of times, if you have a population of 40,000 or under, you don't have to do Marcus alert. If you're anybody else, there is a delay for the onset of that. HB 1282 is an interesting asset forfeiture expanded use. If you've got asset forfeiture money in your jurisdiction, it now includes the language is to strengthen relationships between the community and law enforcement, encourage goodwill between the community and law enforcement, or promote cooperation with law enforcement. I think that's a nice expansion. I think it, at least in theory, could be used for victims, be used for cooperating witnesses, for financial needs with those broad terms. I think that's a benefit. SB 17, I think we've already heard about that a couple of times this week, allowing the rehire of retired law enforcement officer without retraining if they've retired within 5 years. SB 150 and HB 748, that's a technical change. Instead of using lids for your DNA, you're using the Forensic Science DNA Data Bank. SB 207 and HB 1130 Already, full-time law enforcement officers can purchase their service weapon upon retirement. This expands it to include part-time officers. SB 327 and HB 750 is elimination of quotas. There is a provision in that law that says that you cannot use quotas as your sole means for review of performance of an officer. So that means you can use it, just not as your sole basis for review. SB 675 is the purchase of a service weapon by a law enforcement officer does not require a record check. SB 743 and a law enforcement officer who leaves or retires because of PTSD can retain their ID and badge. Bills that impact the patrol and investigative function. Just an assortment of failed bills. Again, it's not exhaustive, but kind of the interesting highlights. HB 1281 was a bill that required that you not use any inauthentic replica documents. There was a situation in Virginia Beach where some law enforcement officers created a false DNA lab with presumably Department of Forensic Science letterhead, and they used that in an interrogation. And that is actually already against the law, so this bill was unnecessary. But this bill was specifically generated because of that, and I think that the Courts Committee saw that it was perhaps overbroad and not necessary, so that one failed. SB 246 required that the law enforcement advise the purpose of the stop before asking for ID. I think oftentimes that's practice and procedure, but to make it into law would have potentially impacted safety. And so that was opposed and it failed. HB 428, that was creating a policy requiring DCJS to create a policy for the use of confidential informants in drug-related investigations, saying that you cannot use anybody basically related to probation. So if you've got a probation violation, you can't be a CI. If you have one pending, if you're recently found guilty of probation violation, you can't be a CI, which kind of undercuts the point of a CI. HB 1209, prohibition on the use of a single photo ID or show-up identification. This is one I testified on. There are only 3 ways to identify suspects: single photo ID, show-up, or a photo lineup, and they wanted to get rid of 2 of them. That died in Courts Committee. SB 746, prohibition on the use of deception during an interview of a juvenile criminal suspect. That bill said that you cannot deceive, so you cannot lie, but you cannot also deceive in any way a juvenile when interviewing. So you have a 17-year-old arrested for murder, you can't say, you've already been identified. That would toss out any subsequent confession. That died. What passed? HB 671, the Hope Card program. Interesting, just to make a note of, it now requires the clerk to issue something like a credit card that has all the protective order information on it for the recipient of a protective order. So when you respond to a scene and somebody says, I have a protective order, you can ask to see the little card. It's easier to keep up with. It would be easier to get the information to law enforcement. So it can be a helpful piece. HB 1334, it amends the definition of abused or neglected child. This is interesting for your obligations as a mandatory reporter for child abuse. Currently, the law only requires mandatory reporting of abuse and neglect by a parent or guardian. This expands the definition for sexual abuse to include an intimate partner of the parent or guardian in abuse that you would have to report to CPS, or anyone else would have to report. SB 741, the facial recognition technology use, as John mentioned, it returns it to the hands of local law enforcement. There are some specific enumerated uses. They're pretty broad, but there are specific uses. There are specific reporting and notice requirements if you're going to use it, and there are criminal penalties for misuse. And the second offense of misuse is not only a Class 1 misdemeanor, but it's a mandatory firing. SB 102 was a bill to expand the arrest and pursuit. What the bill originally was trying to do is to say when you are pursuing somebody who does not have a warrant and you pursue them into another jurisdiction and you're in flight, or in pursuit of somebody in flight, and you catch them, the bill already, or the statute already allows you to get the original warrant from the original jurisdiction. This bill was intended to allow you to get all of the crimes that were committed along the way from one magistrate visit. It didn't quite make it through that way, so you still have to do multiple magistrate visits, but that was the hope. SB 149, HB 731 is a new bill that law enforcement must allow juvenile records inspection by the parent and attorney. So that would include criminal records as well as other records. It's a mandatory review. New bills impacting schools. A couple bills failed. There was HB 37 requiring the employment of at least one SRO in every middle and high school. Didn't make it through. HB 89, an attempt to return disorderly conduct to schools, was halfway through amended to just reflect for high schools. It still did not make it. Still no disorderly conduct at school. What passed? HB 873, requiring a school safety training for law enforcement to act as a school liaison. HB 1215, there's 1 hour of personal safety training in 7th grade to be done in conjunction with law enforcement. SB 36 and HB 4 is perhaps one of the more high-profile changes that requires principals to report crimes to law enforcement. The more recent change said only certain felonies have to be reported. This bill returns some of that, so it would include a misdemeanor sexual battery. It's not explicit in there, but the range of crimes to be reported includes that type of misdemeanor. SB 600 and HB 1129 is school safety audits. The school safety audit must be done in collaboration with the chief law enforcement officer of the jurisdiction. SB 649 is law enforcement is to report charges of a student to a principal. That's the law. It now is expanded to say if you've got a juvenile who's a suspect, not just charged, you can report to the principal. Few changes to the criminal code itself. There was a bill to make improper driving chargeable. That failed. HB 366, SB 453, and HB 613 were 3 different bills that were attempting to undo assault on law enforcement for certain populations. They all failed. We fought against those. They were basically focused on folks who have mental disabilities or intellectual disabilities, but the law already protects that, so we were able to kill those. The law remains the same. What did pass? HB 179 and SB 186, the farm use placard. It now must be issued, registered with DMV. It's a one-time placard. There's no re-registration like with a regular license plate, but now there will be a license number associated with every farm use placard and an application process to get rid of the fake farm use. HB 451, a stalking venue changed. It now includes if you have a stalker who's out of state, it can still be prosecuted if your victim receives stalking communications, and it can be prosecuted in the jurisdiction where the victim was when they received it. HB 16 and SB 63. It's an affirmative defense to child abandonment. You hear safe haven laws. That's this. It expands it to 30 days after birth if they abandon a baby. There's a change in the vicious dog procedure. It's just a cleanup of the code, so it can be prosecuted where the vicious dog resides or where the vicious conduct happened. SB 758 takes out switchblade from the definition of weapon for which sale prohibited. I think that's a class 3 or 4 misdemeanor. SB 777, the emergency statute, where you can stop for the Carolina squad. There were quite a few bills put in to address the catalytic converter theft issue. Only one version of that made it out, HB 740 and SB 729. It adds to the tampering with a motor vehicle statute, so it is, I think, probably the most provable way of any of these different codes. If there is evidence of tampering, damaging, all the same words in the tampering with a motor vehicle statute, for the purposes of getting a catalytic converter, it gets a Class 6 felony. So that's something that's actually, I think, usable. There were a number of firearms bills that were put in to change the requirements. These are a few of them. Carrying a concealed weapon without a permit, reduction to a civil penalty, a repeal of the prohibition of guns in church, removing the authority for a locality to make gun ban bills, and then the related SB 61 exempting people with a concealed weapon permit, law enforcement officers, prosecutors, and judges from any local ordinance banning the possession of guns. All of those failed. That summarizes our couple of months in the legislature. While the legislature was in session, there were a number of sheriffs here and deputies that were recognized by Delegate Terry Austin's memorial. I don't know if John has any final comments.
I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so you ready for me to close it out? Sorry? Yeah, all done.
All right, so I saw Sheriff Barron a little earlier. Is he still in the room? He's walking around someplace. I did want to thank him and his team for hosting us for this conference. All of his folks have been utmost professional and kind during this. I wanted to extend my thanks to Sheriff Barron for that. As we get ready to close out this session, just keep in mind that on June 20th to 24th is the NSA conference in Kansas City. I know a number of us are going to be there, where we're going to recognize Sheriff Crawford at that time for being named the Sheriff of the Year nationally. So I hope to see a few there for that. The VSA conference coming up in the oceanfront of Virginia Beach, September 19th through 21st. And then next year's VSI conference is going to be at the Homestead. And that'll be April 26th. It starts up next year at the Homestead. Hope to see everybody at least at the VSA and the VSI conferences coming up, and several of you at the National Sheriff's Association. So with that, we're going to wrap up our conference for this year. I appreciate everybody's patience and cooperation through all this, and you all have safe travels back to your jurisdictions. Thank you very much.